wasn't just the only wireless carrier that would hire a guy like me back in my college years. It was also one of the fastest growing cellular companies in America.
By 2004, Nextel had amassed nearly 20 million subscribers by furnishing business customers with durable phones that offered a feature no one else could duplicate: a built-in nationwide walkie-talkie. But less than 2 years later, the storied brand that had taken nearly 2 decades to build up would crumble into a punchline, following a merger so devastating it almost sank the company that bought it. I'm Michael Fisher, and this is how Nextel went from getting things done to just, well, done.
It's become a cliche to refer to any smaller company as a scrappy underdog, but one of the things I always liked about Nextel is that it actually lived up to that name. It was always maneuvering, it's always scheming to become something more than it was.
The company was born in 1987 as the New Jersey-based Fleet Call, which sold dispatch radio services to companies with, fleets they had to call. Think taxi cabs, moving trucks, things like that. Over the next decade of mergers and acquisitions, Fleet Call would buy most of its rivals, acquire enough licenses to offer two-way radio service across the country, and earn 1 million customers by 1997. In the process, it ditched its stodgy name for a more futuristic portmanteau. And as Americans started buying cell phones in big numbers, the newly named Nextel partnered with Motorola to introduce a new kind of mobile. I know, today this i1000 Plus seems archaic, with its extendable antenna, monochrome LCD, and beefy frame, even for the period. But it was much smaller than any Nextel that had come before, and more importantly, it packed the 4 features that would come standard with every Nextel going forward: voice calling, text messaging, wireless web, and direct connect, aka the Nextel Walkie-Talkie.
It ensures instant contact. Bridget.
Got it.
And it makes other cell phones
Ready now.
obsolete.
Now, having a walkie-talkie built into your phone won't make any sense to you if you weren't there. And even if you were, it's easy to forget why, for a minute there, we were all totally cool with our friends just barging into our lives at the push of a button. But there were good reasons for it.
On construction sites and in the public sector, that reason was utility. But the reason consumers got on board boiled down, as it often does, to money. See, these days we're spoiled by unlimited plans that don't care how much we talk. But at the turn of the century, the average mobile phone plan only gave you a few hundred daytime minutes every month. And if you went beyond that budget, well, that 40 cents a minute of overage added up in a hurry. Well, if you had a Nextel and your friend had a Nextel, avoiding a big bill like that was just a button press away.
Where are you at?
Most rate plans included unlimited direct connect, so average people soon got hooked on this feature that business and blue-collar workers had loved for years. And the more of your friends had Nextel, the more you could talk for free. It's kind of like Apple's iMessage today. In certain circles, for a particular age group who had grown up with toy walkie-talkies, it became the in thing to have a Nextel.
Hit me on the Nextel chirp.
And there were more benefits to Direct Connect that didn't get much publicity back in the day. Direct Connect required less bandwidth than a full-fat phone call, so even if Nextel's iden network couldn't let you dial out, sometimes the walkie-talkie would work. That bore itself out on September 11th, and I experienced it personally during the Northeast blackout of 2003. When I called my boss to ask her if I should close the store and go home, calls wouldn't go through. But Direct Connect did. And yeah, she did let me go home.
And it's important to note that the walkie-talkie calls also used the Nextel network. That meant you could be standing in your kitchen in Virginia and call your parents in New York in less than a second with the touch of a button. I know, because I did it for years.
Direct Connect was far and away Nextel's biggest differentiator. Its appeal to business customers meant Nextel could charge more than the competition, which gave it some of the highest average revenues per user in the industry. Of course, the competition tried to replicate Direct Connect, but it failed. Verizon Push-to-Talk, Sprint ReadyLink, Alltel Touch-to-Talk, Singular PTT, all of them made you choose from a small pool of specialty phones, and none of them could replicate the speed or reliability of Direct Connect, which was built into every Nextel phone.
Now, the network that made that push-to-talk superiority possible is the same network that would directly lead to Nextel's demise. But before we get to that, I just want to pause here at the company's peak so we can bask in the glow of some of these one-of-a-kind phones.
As Nextel got more serious about the consumer space, its phone designs got more and more assertive, as though Motorola wanted them to look as distinctive as they sounded. 2002's i95CL brought a color screen, retro-futuristic design, and unheard-of $400 price point to Nextel. And the following year brought the sleeker i730 with a much sharper display, futuristic blue LED backlighting, and an insanely loud speakerphone, not to mention some pretty rad ringtone disco lights. 2004's i830 single-handedly swept away the perception that all Nextel phones were bricks for construction workers. Mushy buttons? Yeah, they were awful. Terrible battery life? 100%. I hated it. But it didn't matter, because it was the first Nextel small enough to let you ditch the belt clip. The i860 followed, bringing camera phones to the carrier with an anemic 0.3 megapixel shooter that I relied much too often on. The first MP3 phone was the i870 in 2005. Windows Mobile joined the party with the i930, for better or worse, in the same year. My first smartphone was a BlackBerry 7520, one of the few non-Motorola devices on the network. And all the while, Nextel kept the core customers happy with the ruggedized, rough-and-tumble phones they had come to expect. And the phones were supported by advanced, useful services. I mean, I was getting turn-by-turn GPS navigation on my Nextel all the way back in 2004. That's 5 years before the feature would start to gain real popularity with Android 2.0. It was a great time to be a phone nerd. As Nextel prepaid brand Boost Mobile described it, phones had just gotten fun.
He said it! He said it!
And the timing couldn't have been better. Wireless local number portability was a new law that let people keep their phone number if they switched carriers. Also new was the rebooted ad campaign, which plastered every major metro, every Sunday paper, every TV spot, every NASCAR race, every cash bag, every 16-year-old box of fossilized mints, every whatever this is, with Nextel's reimagined black and yellow brand and signature tagline. Together, it was a perfect storm that prompted nearly 3 million people to bring their numbers to Nextel in 2004 alone. And it led a longtime competitor to make an offer.
When the news broke that Nextel was entering into a so-called merger of equals with Sprint, I was working at Nextel, slinging cell phones, and I remember going to lunch with a friend and coworker to the Olive Garden and just talking it out and saying, this doesn't make any sense. The networks are incompatible. The customer bases are completely different target markets. But hey, I'm an acting student. I'm not a business major, so it's very possible that there are things here I'm missing. Maybe this makes sense, more sense than it appears to on its face. And hey, at least we'll get to sell cooler phones.
Not only were Sprint's phones sleeker and more diverse, they were more advanced. Sprint's CDMA network offered proper 3G data speeds, over 10 times faster than Nextel's iden network. And there were other reasons the merger made sense. See, to build new cellular networks in the US, you need licenses to use particular sets of airwaves, and Sprint and Nextel's license portfolios were complementary in some ways. And most importantly, each company had come to believe it couldn't compete with the bigger players unless it joined forces with somebody. Trouble is, by the time the merger closed in August 2005, the cracks in Nextel's iden network were starting to show in a big way. It wasn't just slow data. Iden was also less efficient than newer networks, which meant it couldn't serve as many customers at the same time. Remember, Nextel had just seen its biggest growth ever in 2004, and at the same time, it was being forced to reband vast swaths of its network to reduce interference it was causing with public safety radios. And that rebanding only exacerbated the capacity problems.
So what do you have? A Nextel network with no high-speed data and no prospects for any, no roaming capability, slow and unreliable texting, and phones that had to be specially made for it, so they were more expensive. The only thing it had going for it, really, was voice calls and direct connect, and those were crumbling fast. In fact, I'll always remember almost selling a guy on like a fleet of Nextel phones. He took my business card, and he actually did end up calling me back. And I think he was ready to buy, but my phone, my Nextel phone, couldn't maintain a connection. The call kept dropping. It was like a bad joke. And no, he did not end up buying any Nextel phones.
The competition, of course, was all too happy to add salt to the oversold Nextel network's wounds. Those competitors started offering rate plans with unlimited mobile-to-mobile calling. So if you were a Verizon customer, for example, calling another Verizon customer, well, you wouldn't be billed for those minutes. At the same time, text messaging was absolutely exploding in America, which seemed to satiate the same need for instant communication that had formerly pushed people to direct connect. That further eroded the one real differentiator Nextel had left, and subscribers started fleeing the network. And to add insult to injury, those folks weren't hopping over to the Sprint side of the house. Instead, many were taking their phone numbers to the competition. As a retail grunt on the front lines, I knew we were in trouble, but I had no idea just how bad it was until last year, when I saw this interview with Dan Hesse, who talks about what happened when he first came aboard to replace Sprint Nextel's ousted CEO.
And being presented with a binder. And I went to the business plan section, and it had us going bankrupt in 6 months.
That's a wonderful documentary called The History of Us, and I'll link it in the description for anyone who wants to look at the Sprint side of this story. As for Nextel, well, the brand did not go quietly. It had some interesting last gasps. For example, Motorola created a handful of hybrid phones that would actually operate on both Sprint and Nextel networks simultaneously. If I can ever get past the activation lock on this IC902, I'd love to cover it in a future episode, just because it's such a one-of-a-kind weirdo. Later, Sprint would launch a version of Direct Connect on its CDMA network that worked reasonably well, but nothing would work well enough to reverse the inertia of a consumer culture that had just moved on from push-to-talk. This was 2008, the same year Sprint wrote down the majority of goodwill value related to the Nextel purchase. In other words, Sprint was effectively admitting that it had overpaid for Nextel to the tune of about $31 billion. The iden network would finally be shut down in June 2013, and Sprint would never fully recover from the fiasco, eventually being acquired by T-Mobile in 2020. Today, push-to-talk has reverted to the specialty status it had back in the fleet call days, with many small to medium-sized businesses having sprouted up to deliver long-range radio to the masses. One of those is Relay, which started out as a service focused on keeping parents and their kids connected and then broadened to target white-collar enterprise with its simple, cellular-enabled walkie-talkies.
I will have the vigilance ready.
Unit 1 out.
Another company taking a slightly different approach is Ina with its Kepler communicators, which are larger and louder devices. They're targeted at business and industry, and they also give you the option of calling over a 4G network or calling directly from device to device, much like the direct talk mode I used on the old Nextel phones earlier in this video. Now, there is a company in Florida that seems to have resurrected the Nextel brand for its own white label communications offering. But if there's a true spiritual successor to Nextel in 2021, it's gotta be AT&T FirstNet. From specialty Samsung smartphones to heavy Harris handhelds,
Yeah.
AT&T's push-to-talk has something for everyone. And not just on the phone side. As I showed you in one of my weirder road trip videos, if you're a public agency or a corporation in need of coverage even where coverage doesn't exist, FirstNet and its manufacturing partners offer literally a cell site in a suitcase just for you. And closer to home in an emergency, it has priority classes and other access overload measures to make space available on crowded cellular networks so critical communications can get through. I'll drop links to all these companies down in the description. It would be easy to cast Sprint as the villain of this story. You know, the incompetent corporation that mismanaged something wonderful into oblivion. But for all the missteps Sprint did make, I think it's fair to say that by 2005, Nextel had reached the end of its road one way or the other. I mean, it just had so many challenges facing it, and it just seemed unable to scheme its way past the final, epic challenge of obsolescence. Ultimately, that day comes for all of us. I just hope when it comes for me, I'll have a multi-billion-dollar payout to show for it. And if not that, well, then at least a little recognition for having cemented the legacy of a time when walkie-talkies were built into your phones. And those phones were fun. This video was produced with a mix of devices purchased by me, purchased by my publisher, Future PLC, and on loan from the companies mentioned. No company was given editorial input, copy approval rights, or an early preview, nor did any company provide compensation for this coverage. And if this wasn't enough nostalgia for you, be sure to check out the whole When Phones Were Fun series at the MrMobile on YouTube. Until next time, I've been Michael Fisher. Thanks for watching. And stay mobile, my friends.